Well, folks, it looks like we're not in the clear yet as it comes to another global pandemic. It turns out that Ebola and not hantavirus is in the running to become the next global pandemic, having killed already almost 200 Ugandans and rerouting a flight from France to Detroit. Trying to be a responsible content creator here, I will say that the World Health Organization has said not to worry as of yet. Fun fact, I was actually in Dallas the weekend that Ebola broke out in 2014. I was going to Oklahoma University for one semester in the fall of 2014, and there was some game in Dallas-Fort Worth area. I can't remember if it was with one of the Texas Tech Institutes. And yeah, that was the exact weekend that Ebola broke out, and it was all over the news, and everyone was in a panic. And I'm definitely no expert on Ebola, but if it goes anything like my Texas trip that year, then if we just have a bunch of Fireball and some vodka mixed with some Cane's sweet tea, then it should all go away on its own. This week on the podcast, we're going to continue to talk about the UFO files. I just happened to get a majority of the way through them when the Department of War, of course, releases its second batch today. We'll be talking about Project Sign as it relates to the documents that have already been put out by the Department of War. We're also going to be talking about Jeffrey Epstein as he relates to the Leviathan oil field, which is off the coast of Israel. Turns out Epstein was a major mover in trying to get investors for the Leviathan oil field in the 2010s. And then I'm going to do a monologue about factionalism as it relates to the American Uniparty, foreign policy, and the war in Iran. You can always follow the show on Instagram or TikTok, or you can send us an email at info@jetfuelcan'tmeltsteelbeams.com. I'm your host, Michael Mooney, and this is episode number 23.
This is the age of misinformation, get information. No homosexuals, Democrats, or immigrants in your nation. I gotta think about anything else. I try to cope, but it's bad for my health. I don't even think that anything helps. This is the most paranoid that I've felt. This is the age of misinformation. How could you?
Alrighty, folks. So it looks like just as I finished getting through the first batch of UFO files, the Department of War conveniently drops the entire second batch. So that's definitely all fun. I thought we'd use this section to go through the notables for the Department of War section of the UFO Disclosure batch number 1. There really aren't that many notables in the first place, but there are some important things to understand, especially if you're not versed in the UFO world or ufology. And at this point, for the first batch, I've gone through just about every file except a few of the FBI files and some of the State Department files. But as you comb through the documents, especially the Department of War documents, you see that a lot of the UFO reports are from the late 1940s. And there's really no in between. It seems like there's two kinds of incidents. They're either from the late 1940s, directly after World War II, or they're from the 2020s. And there's definitely a reason for that we'll get into. One thing you might notice when you look through the first batch of documents is that especially in the 1940s, the government's taking the idea of flying saucers quite seriously. And this contradicts a lot of the imagery we get surrounding the government and UFOs. So for someone that's not versed in ufology, you might think that you would go into these documents and see the government give explanations for these objects or have these internal memos that say like, hey, this person's unreliable or crazy, or, how can we kind of like get like a psychological operation out of this one. But instead, what you see in the 1940s are all these incident documents that, go in painstaking detail what happens in these UFO sightings. And again, a lot of them happened directly after World War II, and even as World War II is ending. At first, when I saw these documents either talk about the 40s or the 2020s, I thought to myself that this was probably because of Project Sign. So when World War II ends and we start shifting towards a Cold War mindset where the USSR becomes our primary enemy, the idea of seeing unidentified flying objects in the sky wasn't to be taken lightly. We have a bunch of new technology that the Nazis were creating before their downfall that the Soviets may have gotten their hands on. One example is the Horton bomber that we talked about last week. And so there were a couple possibilities. It could have either, from the government's eyes, been a top secret government project from the USA itself. It could have been an unidentified new bomber craft from the Soviet Union, or it could have an extraterrestrial or unknown origin. So in the lead up to 1948, we see across these documents a lot of references to an upcoming project. And as the incident reports become more plenty and even more organized, we lead up to something called Project Sign. Another name for the project was Project Saucer, but it was an official U.S. government study of UFOs undertaken by the Air Force and it was active for most of 1948 to close out the 40s. And until the US government restructured itself in 1947 through the National Security Act, most of the purview of all of this did fall under the War Department. One pretty notable thing about Project Sign is that the Air Force technically didn't rule out the idea that these unidentified flying objects might be extraterrestrial in origin, but then the higher-ups at the Air Force sort of reject this hypothesis and replace Project Sign with Project Grudge. Eventually, Project Blue Book, as you've probably seen in a number of UFO documentaries, comes up to plate next. By Project Blue Book, the CIA, NSA, and even the Navy are getting involved. But the main thing to understand about this is that after Project Sign, most of the ways and methods that the Air Force and the government would look into UFOs becomes quite a bit more secretive and methodical, especially since Project Grudge was almost thrown together to disprove the hypothesis of an extraterrestrial origin in the first place. So that's the main reason why you have documents from the late 40s and then documents from the 2020s. Essentially, the methodology for how the government investigated UFOs changes after Project Sign. Everything goes much more underground, and the Trump administration claims that right now, and we'll see with the second batch, that it's these documents from the 1950s to basically the 2010s that are being scrubbed at the moment for release. And by the 2020s, we see major increases in technology, and of course, disclosure itself becomes quite the political act. So again, for the late 1940s, all these reports on different sightings are taken pretty seriously. Just like with the cases we talked about last week with the FBI looking into things, most of these cases are going to be a mixture between misidentified objects like asteroids or celestial bodies. There are going to be hoaxes and even experimental government aircraft in some cases. One great example of this is the Flapjack, or the Chance Vought V-173. It was an experimental aircraft that could have easily been mistaken for a UFO. But besides that, all the incident reports from the 1940s are just pretty arduous to go through. But then when you get to the documents and the videos and photographs for the 2020s, looks like things are different entirely. Here we have something from 2023. It's called Orbs Launching Orbs. And again, this is from the U.S. Department of War. 3 teams of 2 federal law enforcement special agents each independently describe seeing orange orbs in the sky emit or launch smaller red orbs in groups of 2 to 4, with 3 being the general consensus. This is stated to have occurred at least 5 times. Each time, the orange orb would appear, launch red orbs, then disappear. The orange orb was only visible for 1 to 2 seconds. The red orbs would generally move away from the orange mother orb in a horizontal path, but in a couple of instances, one red orb was started to move heading up at an angle, while another witness stated sometimes the red orbs would swoop down after being launched from the larger orange orb. These events were witnessed by multiple teams from varying locations and vantage points over a 2-day period. Due to the sequential nature of the events, it is not known whether there was a single orange mother orb that released the groups of red orbs or whether there were multiple orange orbs at play. So that's pretty hard to explain away. As we start finishing out the 2020s, one of the biggest advents in technology that people will talk about, especially militarily, will definitely be drones. And this orbs launching orbs memo from the Department of War got me thinking that, of course, technology wouldn't look the exact same from human species to alien species, but maybe this is their type of drone technology with a drone mothership and everything. Here's an interesting document from 2023, very, very highly redacted. Reported appearance. An individual reported observing a large blue, featureless triangular object with a solid, unwavering silhouette, emitting powerful whitish-blue light from multiple points along its perimeter. The report described the object as hovering stationary above or near a national security facility for approximately 3 minutes. They then reported observing it move to a position higher in their field of view. The reporter characterized the object's motion as backing up, in a jerking or jumping manner inconsistent with smooth jet propulsion. The individual reported that they observed the object for approximately 8 minutes. That one's really interesting because when we usually think of the triangular craft, we think of these long, black, sleek objects, not really these blue ones that are emitting whitish blue light beams. But again, it's hard to corroborate just one instance of eyewitness testimony. Another theme is that there's lots and lots of sightings in the Middle East. I don't know if this was just because, maybe this is where the War Department was, and so that's where we got the footage, or whether it was put out that way on purpose. Maybe the aliens are dispensationalists as well. When you get to the documents about the 2020s, you're going to see a lot of mission reports specifically, especially from the Middle East. And we have ones like this, which are except for the description of what the pictures are. These ones are completely redacted, just black. You really can't tell anything from these reports except that they obviously, with a control F or just looking, they mention the word UAP on them, and that they represent some form of credible sighting of something in this decade. You also get a bunch of these, which are called range Fowler reports. A range Fowler is a U.S. Navy and Department of Defense term for any unauthorized object, aircraft, or activity that interrupts pre-planned military training or restricted airspace. A range Fowler debriefing refers to the specific interview and standardized reporting process used when military aviators encounter these objects. Historically treated as highly classified materials shared only with the Five Eyes intelligence alliance, many of these reports and debrief forms have been declassified and released through the Department of the Navy's Freedom of Information Act reading room. So basically, these are some pretty top secret documents that if it weren't for this disclosure, we weren't going to see until at least the 2040s. They all look like this with a bunch of areas that you can fill out on the form. And then they'll have a description of the event. For example, for this one, saw the initial object fly through the screen and started tracking it. Initial object was surpassed by another object of same size and shape, but much higher speed. At one point during tracking the objects, there were 3 on the screen at the same time, moving amongst each other. So there you kind of have it. There's really not too much going on in the first batch of what the War Department gave us for the UFO files. There are some pretty interesting videos and mission reports from the 2020s, and even just glancing at some of the videos from the second tranche of documents, some of them do look pretty freaky, I'm not gonna lie. I wanted to end this segment by returning back to the Horton Brothers bomber because I saw one more reference when going through the War Department's documents from 1947, and I know this is just, one piece of paper of many, but it's another reference to these 1800 aircraft. So the second paragraph from this page reads, a recent report from the U.S. military attaché, Moscow, USSR, dated 9 June 1947, indicates that 1800 aircraft, directly or indirectly based on the Horton 8 design, 6-engine pusher, having a wing spread of 131 feet and a gross weight of approximately 33,000 pounds, are being built for bomber squadron use. The Russian version, however, is jet-propelled. Reference report whose identification number is V322918. So yeah, this might be referring to some plan that the U.S. government obtained that shows that Moscow is trying to recreate these bombers. Or maybe it's one of the most heavily kept secrets from World War II that there really were 1,800 of these aircraft that were made by the Nazis, which got essentially proliferated between maybe a few in the US and mostly in the Soviet Union. Either way, there's some real strange shit up in the sky, people, and they don't want you talking about the Epstein files, which leads us right into our next segment.